Okay, it's working.
Perfect.
The snow didn't take down the internet. We have like this skift of snow, Christy, and I don't know about you, but it feels like we are acting in Alberta kind of like it's our little bit of Armageddon, when really that's what Manitoba is going to face in the next couple of days.
It's so true. Every year, I think we forget that we shouldn't be doing anything literally outdoors planning until like after the May long. And I don't know why we keep forgetting this.
Yeah. I think because our calendar tricks us, right? Because spring officially arrives on the calendar on the 21st of March. Like, it's just like, I think I don't want to knock the calendar making people of life, but I feel like they got that wrong a little bit. No, I don't know.
It's true. Yeah. There's some years where you're like, okay, it's spring. And some years, like most years, it's like, no, I'm not doing this because I know it's going to snow again here. And
yeah. Well, because my son the other day was like, Mom, like, you should change your winter tires over. I'm like, oh, no, son. We have at least 2 more snowstorms for Mommy to drive through. Like, this is going to happen. You wait. Mark my words.
It's true. It's legit. Yep. Yesterday, a lady was coming to one of the sessions that I was hosting, and same thing. She was a little bit late, but because she had already changed over her tires, and so she was kind of like doing the whole slidey along the road, and hoping not to pinball off of anybody at that point. And yeah, I was like, nope, too early. Like
too early.
Yeah, aim for the end of May, beginning of June.
Yeah, exactly.
Hey, away from March and April.
Like, just know, like, winter tires you should have on for at least 7 months.
It's true. We get a month and a half of summer, and then we go right back into getting cold. So
it's just the way it is. Well, it looks like the gang's rolling in. Good morning, Helen, Cheryl, Angie, everybody else who's joining us. Some don't comment, but we know you're hanging out. But as you join us, please say hello in the comments. And welcome to Virtual Coffee Club, our live podcast. And guys, we convinced her to come back for a second time, and hoping to be many more. Welcome back to hanging out with us, Christy Morgan. How are you today? Besides cold.
Cold. Yeah, no, I'm doing good. It's a good week so far. I mean, it's coming to a short week, and it's always those balances of yay, short week, but you're like, ooh, short week, so you gotta cram everything in. But it's like been going really, really good so far, which has been really nice. Like, it's been a nice, steady and consistent manner of work. So that's been great.
Yeah. Well, I feel like time went by so quickly because yesterday I was like, oh, holy crap, I got to send Christy our link for the show. How is it the 13th of April already? Like, the time is going by so fast.
It is. Yeah, it is. Or is that just like my grandma used to always say that, or is that just something that we start saying more?
I don't know. Maybe it's as we're aging. Time sure is going fast, hey, Christy? Like, honestly.
I'm like, I feel like as kids, you're like, oh, plenty of time. There's a full day of playing. And as adult, you're like, okay, between cooking, cleaning, getting work done. And you're like, all right, it's now Thursday. And where did it go? And it's Friday, and then blink, it's Monday. And you're like, where's the time? Yeah.
Well, on Monday's show, we were talking about challenging ourselves to honor our inner child this week. And so to do something playful and fun. And then I came across this really funny meme yesterday when I was scrolling through socials, and it was like, I don't have an inner child, I have an inner old lady, and she likes to do this and go to bed by 8 p.m. and says the wrong things. And I was like, oh my gosh, I think I have an inner old lady too. Like, they're fighting in there. Yeah.
So good.
Funny. Good morning, Corey. Well, I thought in today's conversation we would start with I mean, it's going to feel deep for an early Wednesday morning conversation, but that was the whole point of having you come and chat with us, Christy. And one of the things that I've heard a lot about I don't know if it becomes catchphrase, if it just becomes awareness, or it becomes just something that people are starting to talk about in circles, but I hear the phrasing cultural appropriation or cultural misappropriation quite a bit. And I feel like this is a highly misunderstood area.
Right.
I think I can be bold enough to say that because I don't know a ton about it in my own self. So I looked up the definition, and basically it's like somebody taking something that doesn't belong to your culture is kind of the most simplistic way to talk about it, but it's not really a simplistic thing. So I don't know where we start on that, Christy, or what comes into your mind, or maybe things that you've experienced or have been teaching and sharing with people of late. But how do we manage what this is in our life and continuing to be kind?
Yeah, absolutely. Great topic. Yeah, I mean, there's been times for sure where I've come up against someone appropriating our Indigenous culture in a way that, whether or not they knew is going to be offensive. And so, it's those moments where it's one thing for someone to take it and do it and knowingly know that someone's going to say something, or that they know that it's not going to be received very well. But it's always the tricky part when people, I think, do something without thinking it might be offensive, or just not seeing it from that angle, right?
Right.
Seeing both situations over my years, it is very different to have different conversations with both of those people, right? It's very different interaction with someone who knows that they're doing something to offend people. It's a very different conversation than someone's that's literally like, I have no idea, I had no clue. Or on the other spectrum of, I don't get it, and I don't care that you're offended, right? So,
I don't know how to unpack that. Yeah.
right. Those are fun moments. And so yeah, there's been, lots of things where I've seen, some of us might have seen like, different things where you might see like an example from our community would be around where we've seen in magazines or different things where people have been using like headdresses. Right. Or the conversations around even in some of the major sports leagues and what that looks like, and names and or actions done by those done within those arenas. And I think a lot of it, it comes down to, when I look at some of these pieces, I've been down to the States and been in those situations where I've been at major sports events and things like that have happened. I'm not necessarily going to run down to the mic on the middle of the ice or whatever and start like giving everyone a high lecture in the middle of the game. But again, it's taking those moments to reflect and figure and determine when to have a good conversation. Because it is hard to have that conversation, and it is going to be very, I think, in some cases, very individual for a person. So there's lots of we've seen some good conversation come from our national sports leagues with Indigenous communities now, which I don't think necessarily has happened in the past. Well, actually hasn't happened in the past, about some of these actions and things that have been a long-standing, like, historical and traditional aspect in communities. But again, I think there's just that disconnect of understanding of how ingrained sometimes are some actions and values and belief systems are so ingrained in what's considered the norm in society. And so when we question people's values and the norms, because you're upsetting the balance system, that's where you get friction, right? And that's the part that needs to happen sometimes, is you need to have some of that friction. I don't mean like friction in terms of like anarchy necessarily, but that friction point where you do need to make sometimes the conversation very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
In order to do that.
And I think too, there's probably, like anything, there's a varying degree, and not that a varying degree becomes an excuse, but I think that there's, an example that comes to mind for me is that I watched a conversation happen between two people. And so one of the people was referring to their group of friends as their tribe. And this other person then was offended by the use of that word and really defended that being cultural misappropriation. And the other person being like, but I'm just referring to like what a definition of a tribe would be. And so that's one that I feel like isn't the same degree as a sporting event who, is really going over the top with an example like that you've shared to this, but how do we manage a conversation like that? And is that like, it's hard to be like, is that true or untrue? Like, was that, because I don't think they were even thinking that the word tribe is owned by a particular culture. But the other person did. And so then it becomes like, how do we have those conversations with just, do we just hear each other out? Is using the word tribe an example of that? Like, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great example. I have, yes, absolutely heard that, or having, being in sessions and people saying, let's gather for a powwow,
Yeah.
which you sometimes hear in the
Yeah.
office area. For me, when I've been in those situations, I've often taken that moment to then reflect on having a conversation with that person afterwards.
Yeah.
And it's not so much that I don't think we necessarily own the word per se, and this is only from my perspective. I mean, others will have their own. We don't own the word, but it's how society has created that norm of that connotation of how it's utilized, right? And so us questioning, like, how'd that even become part of the norm to say that? Like,
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure back in the 1700s, they might not have been saying around their workplace, hey, let's gather for a powwow.
Yeah.
Right. And so like, where did this aspect of seeping in of these phrases or these catchwords take a turn, right? Because I mean, there's nothing wrong in terms of the word itself, a tribe, like apple, like all these things, like pens, pencils, like they're words, but I think it's on how it's being utilized, and also being just mindful that just given someone's background and maybe some of the experiences they've had. So as a racialized person, I mean, there definitely have been situations as in my childhood that wagon burner, apple, making fun of a child running around, pretend like you're an Indian. It's those words that get associated with an event that trigger sometimes some of these pieces, and so we never know fully where that person's coming from. And so that is often part of the conversation of, like, I've had that with, many past colleagues of saying, hey, like, I noticed that you used the word powwow and gathering us as a team. And I don't call it out in that meeting at the moment. I have that individual conversation. And most times it's been, people aren't even thinking of that from that perspective. And that's fine. I'm just like, I'm like, and I just want you to know, like, where here's how it may or may not trigger me, but knowing, like, how we're conscious is sometimes when we have to be mindful of what situation we're in, right? And again, I know that they don't mean any offense by it because I know the person individually, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it comes down to when we live in, and this is, again, it's another word that's used a lot that makes people feel immediately defensive. And I don't think it should. It's like, but when we live in privilege, I think it's part of that learning and that educating ourselves to check in on that. And if someone approaches us with a conversation like that, is just sitting in yourself being like, okay, what did I mean when I say that? Where does it really come from my heart? Okay, if I'm living in a world where kindness matters to me, and that word that I used, even though I didn't mean it in that way, could be felt that way, how do I change using that language without being, but I think we're immediately being like, well, I didn't mean that, and I didn't say it that way, and now you're accusing me of this. Like, it becomes heated when it doesn't need to, when it just is about education.
Absolutely. And it's just, again, like you said, hearing somebody out. It's whether or not, once you have a bit more context from another side, that if you're going to choose to change your behaviors or your actions, right? I mean, those are choices that we make as individuals, right? So, I mean, my cup is here, and like, you're seeing this side, but what I'm seeing from my side, and it's about saying, like, the cup's not wrong. It's just saying we're seeing it from different sides, and whether I choose then to see the cup in a different angle and say, like, okay, now I can understand a different side of that piece, and what I choose to do with that information is a choice I'm actively making, and it's about the accountability we take in those actions following as we garner information, right? We're consistently gathering information as human beings, and every bit of knowledge we gather every day changes how we act throughout our day, whether consciously or unconsciously. And so it's then, once we become aware, we then have to the accountability saying, like, yeah, I actually knew that was offensive to Christy, but I continued to use that term, even when I wanted to call a team meeting.
Yeah.
Right. So that's accountability that I think that person would need to step into and be accountable and say, yeah, I'm actually choosing to make someone else feel uncomfortable.
Yeah. And if if you have questions, you want to ask about something along this topic, please feel free to throw it in the comments. This is a safe space to educate ourselves together, because I think that's the biggest key is, of course, we're going to make mistakes. Of course, we're going to say the wrong things. Of course, we've been conditioned and taught from years of things that people didn't take a moment to understand or didn't know or didn't have capacity or whatever that might look like. So we're going to say it wrong until we learn to say it right. So please feel free to throw something up in the comments. And I think another example of this that I think comes from a good place in people when they're thinking they're doing it, but turns out maybe not to be, is Halloween costumes.
Oh, yes.
I feel like that's another, again, I just want to give people examples of, in case they're like, I have no idea what you mean when you say cultural appropriation or misappropriation. I don't even know which phrasing is right on that, but just giving some examples of, like, Halloween costumes are another place where the point is to dress up as something else, but like, what does that look like? And I feel like you've probably come across that a lot over your years too.
Yeah. I mean, again, I think we were talking about this the other day with another group, and we're talking about that same thing, saying like, yeah, like, I mean, was born in the 70s, and I mean, even looking back at some of like my early like childhood birthday parties that for anyone's from the 70s.
Yeah.
I mean, they used to be like, you'd see like, kids' birthday parties, the paper hats or whatever.
Yeah.
There used to be like little crowns like with feathers.
Yeah.
Right. So like little headdresses and kind of thing. And, you start looking at some of these pieces, and again, okay, you start thinking, okay, was that appropriation, or in what context were they used? And why did we think that that was okay? No different than like, we all like joke saying like, oh yeah, I used to be able to smoke in planes. And we're like, oh my God, like, what are you talking about? Like, that's crazy. That's crazy talk. Right. It's
Exactly.
those pieces of like, yeah, like Halloween is a big, big one. And that's, we see a lot more, I think, debate and I think clashing of, I think, some of those, again, the awareness that you're being offensive versus choosing to ignore that based on privilege, or just wanting, you're going to create some chaos around that, coming up a bit more. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things when we look at Halloween costumes from many different cultures saying like,
yeah,
how did we think this was going to be okay? But at the same time, it's like, are we having conversations with those communities around that? Like, yeah, it's weird how things have sometimes that just seeped into the norm of what was seen as normal. Right.
Or if I'm just playing, like throwing things out for conversation wise, for just to get people thinking, but also like, okay, so it's a Disney movie about a culture that puts out costumes and items based on that movie, and a child wants to dress up like their favorite character from the movie.
Yeah.
Like, that's also another one of those spaces where how does that feel, and how do those conversations look like with your kids, and what do you as parents, like, what do we do in those scenarios?
Yeah.
And again, I'm not saying just because it's okay with Disney that it's okay with the world, but it's another one of those places where I think that as we're trying to educate ourselves, we stop and be like, okay, how does this feel? What does this look like? Where does this really sit with me?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, it is coming down to very individualistic, potentially a household. Like, I know a couple of my friends that, yeah, like their kids loved, certain kids movies, and they were like, like, okay, like I get you like the character, and we watch the movie, like you were saying, but let's have a deeper conversation on like, let's appreciate where this comes from, and let's maybe explore like some conversation around that, and how do we learn more about the culture, and let's have some deeper things saying like, it's, dress up is dress up, and having fun with like makeup and being, all stuff. But again, it's I think how we educate our young people to be very well aware of their actions, again, could create a reaction from something, right? And it's again not, on everyone online, feel free to chime in. I mean, it's not about trying to distance things either, or make everything like taboo and not like you can never do this. But it's again, how are we actually being informed of how we do things, right? So an example might be, so we were just doing a session yesterday on smudge teachings, right?
I was going to ask about that.
Yeah. So we were doing some lessons yesterday, some teachings with a large group of like non-Indigenous folks that about smudging. So they work with the Indigenous populations, and they want to be able to support those that they work with around smudge. And so some of them had never been exposed to smudge. Some of them had been a little bit because of the folks that they work with. But there's always that apprehension of saying like, can I smudge? Like, who does that? Is that cultural appropriation? Because I want to participate. And we were going through the learnings yesterday, saying, as human beings, we're humans first, and culture and ceremonies are the way in which we express where we come from, right? Our communities. And so smudge itself is not necessarily just unique to our Turtle Island, our Indigenous people here. Smudge is similar in many different cultures around the world. There's different medicines and different things that people have used over millennial areas around the world to make ourselves well and to balance out who we are. And so, when we talk about some of these teachings, we're saying, even as Indigenous person, I mean, we're having to go through the learnings and the teachings and gathering of the knowledge and earning the right to be able to speak about some of these pieces. But smudge, and this is what, my elders, I can only speak from my elders and my teaching specifically, they've always taught me that smudge is open for every human being, that we're meant to be, to balance out our wellness. And so when we talk about, those that want to do smudge and whatnot, it's about how you're gathering that information and those teachings around smudge. And so while we could share smudge yesterday with those that were in the room, and they got to come up and see and, smell the medicines and touch the medicines, what we said is that what you can't do is then turn around and run around and buy everything and then say, yeah, I can do smudge, and start talking about it. I said, because that's where, you've been given the, and we always quote it, the permission, because I think that people wait for is the permission. It's not so much the permissions rather than the proper protocol and teachings to that. And we said, yeah, like you absolutely can smudge, but what you can't do, no different than I can. Like I can smudge and I can host smudge for people, because that's what I've been taught. I've been given the teachings behind that. What I can't speak to is the exact medicines, particularly like their origin stories, because I haven't been transferred those rights yet. Until I am, I'm not going to make up stuff or Wikipedia or Google things about the medicine and try and pass it off as knowledge that I know. And that's where I think there's the fine balance of when we see, people were saying yesterday, like, yes, I've heard of like, I'm saging my house, or, as you're walking around with your glass of wine and you're saging the house. Don't do that. We're saying, okay, that's the classic example. We're saying like, yes, you may have seen that, but again, it's questioning, okay, like anyone nowadays can buy medicines in a different form, but it's again, how are you able to speak to how you were given the teachings and from who, right? If, when people ask me who my teachers are, I can name off the people that gave me those teachings, and I should be able to, because if I can't, then that's when we know I've taken information that's not mine.
Right.
And I'm purposely using it in a way that's damaging to sharing information. And so, I think there is that piece. And I think a lot of the colleagues that we were working with yesterday felt a bit more at ease of being able to support those people that they work with, to be say like, yeah, I can be with them when they do smudge. I can even offer to help, light the smudge for them if they feel comfortable for me to do that. I think there was that more piece of like, you need to learn and educate. And as we go along, here's the steps you need to take. So I had to take that myself as an Indigenous person. I don't get a free pass just because I'm born into that piece. I have to learn. And again, it comes back to that knowledge piece as human beings, that as we gather information and we go through systems and we go through protocols and we go through all these steps of actions, that, we garner more and more adaptability. Like, I think of many of the stuff that we have to do in society, and we have to like learn things in order to get that next level credential. Like we
Yeah.
can't just get a driver's license at 6. We have to go through
We're
the
being
steps,
taught
right?
we're being taught things to share for the greater good, right? Like, 'cause you could I mean, ultimately, you could throw into that pile yoga, Reiki, like things that again come from, say, a different culture, but people take the teachings from teachers who are sort of like, again, it's that same passing down of knowledge to be able to share something for the greater good. So going
Absolutely.
to a class where you're learning something else isn't an use an appropriation. It's learning from a teacher who learned from a teacher, as opposed to I just like it and I looked some of stuff up on the internet. Now I'm going to go teach people. Like it's that education piece, and I think that's what it
Mhm.
falls down to. Um, I know that we could probably again talk for hours on it, but what are your thoughts when you hear, because I feel like there's a balance also that comes into, and I never know how it feels when you hear someone say, you're just being hypersensitive about it. And so what's the line between someone being hypersensitive, someone who is educating themselves, or someone who just doesn't understand, I guess?
Yeah, that's always a good one. If someone's like, if you were saying to me and we're in a conversation, you're like, you're being hypersensitive, Christy. Um, I'd be like, thanks, Jody, for the feedback. I am, it seems like you're agitated by having this conversation, and I'd like to unpack why you think I'm being hypersensitive about this a bit more.
Yeah.
Because it seems like, I'm trying to explain my side, but it feels like you are feeling like you might be on the defensive side and deflecting it back to me at this moment. So let's unpack why you would choose to use that word in this conversation.
Yeah. And I think that's when I hear anybody use that phrasing, you're just being hypersensitive. And I'm like, but that also comes from defensiveness, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's just like, okay, well, just check in for a minute. Like, if you're feeling someone's being hypersensitive, is it because you're feeling defensive? And then why? Like, and it doesn't mean you're admitting wrong or guilt or what. It's just about exploring why it feels that
Yeah,
way. Does that make sense?
absolutely. Like, conversations I feel icky, it's because there's something there, and there's that resistance conversation, and resistance is a good thing sometimes because it's just showing us that something's actually off. That it's about then saying, okay, how do I have a deeper dive with this person? It may not be in that moment. It might be maybe the next day or the next week that you're both in a different state of mind, because when we become heightened, our brains aren't going to be in a place to actually have a deeper conversation around some of these really hard topics. It's about how do we then take a moment and say, I feel like we're both in a really defensive state, or a really, moment where we can't actually have a conversation. Can we come back to this later and have a moment to have this discussion?
Yeah. Well, and I think that, yeah, it's allowing yourself to just step into it. And I think that we get afraid. We get afraid of that for some reason. And again, that could come from a conditioning thing, a work piece. But, and again, feel free to anybody who's connecting in this conversation, or if you're catching it later and aren't live with us, feel free to share sort of an experience that you've had, or something you wonder about, or could you do something better? This is a great opportunity. Christy is our teacher in these moments. So whether you like it or not, girlfriend counts.
So I'm like, oh,
She's
Laura's been raised.
and if she doesn't, I just know, Christy, in getting to know you, like if you don't know what the answers of that, you're gonna find that out on by talking to elders or finding out. And it comes down to, I really like that you mentioned protocol of different things. Like it's the teachings, it's the protocol, it's the how. And I feel like, yeah, if we whenever there's a seek of balance, which I feel like balance is something that doesn't really exist, because
Mhm.
balance doesn't have to be balanced. But anyway, that's a whole other deep conversation we could have another day. But it's about, if something again is hypersensitive, like what's the flip side of that? And where's the piece where it comes together? I don't know.
Balance takes work. It's not automatically assumed, and I think that's part of the context, is that we automatically assume that there's balance all the time, and there's not. right? And
No.
that's where I think a lot of those conversations come into play about the hypersensitivity or, the unevenness, that things are not always in balance. We have to, as human beings, we're always having to work at being balanced in all aspects. And so when we come into difficult conversations, it's because it's become more apparent that is absolutely out of balance. And so that's where work is required. And that's part of what our many of our elders would say, that's where our journey needs to be. It's not just automatically assume that there's balance always in our life. Like, we're always, as human beings, we're like, got to pay the mortgage, where the bills are coming from. I got to balance out work stuff. I got to make sure I cook things. Like, there's always this imbalance that, whether we're aware of it or not, there's always these things where you're like, oh, my back hurts, or, got a headache today. Like, there's all things where our bodies are telling us in different things. Our stomachs, our brains are always, we're having to find what we call, quote, quote, balance. And so when things become very clear that they're not well, that's the opportunity to figure out what kind of conversations we need to have and what that looks like, and how are we going to educate to make sure we find a better understanding to create that balance.
When it comes to is, it becomes I think there's, again, this, people have expectation, which that could be a whole other topic we did on another day, but of managing people's emotions. And a lot of the pieces that come into, I think, in cultural learning and appropriation versus appreciation is emotions. And I think, an example that, I don't know if you would want to speak to that directly because it's a different culture, but people were so up in arms in the movement of when companies like Uncle Ben's and Aunt Jemima wanted to remove their packaging, same as sports teams that chose to change the names of their teams. And people were like, oh, people are just being too emotional about it. And but if it's offending someone, we don't manage that person's emotion. We can still disagree with it if we choose to, but we have to be kind through that process. And people just really they got so offended by it. And I'm not sure why, but again, that comes into your self-check of, okay, if you were really mad that Aunt Jemima decided to change their packaging, why? Like, what's
Right.
It's a bottle of syrup. If they want to change their packaging because they want to take away something that has offended a culture for years, what does that matter to you? Like, let that, but do you know what I mean, Christy?
Yeah.
Like, there were so many people that got so offended. And I think the sporting teams that you gave an example off the top were another big one that people just were like, it's just a name.
Yeah. Or it's just an action.
Yeah.
Right. It's just a head dress. It's just me wearing a costume. Like, stop being, again, so sensitive about, and we've been doing this forever. Like, it's a problem. No, it's kind of always been there. It's just the platform to have these conversations hasn't been as necessarily welcomed.
No, not at all. Because when we're uncomfortable, we don't know how to keep going, and we don't know how to sit in that uncomfortable space and get to a place where it is comfortable, and get to a place where you can respect both sides of a story, I guess.
Absolutely. Like, again, comfortability comes in having to expose yourself to uncomfortableness. So for many of our viewers right now, I don't know if you've ever been, when you traveled to another country and you stand there for a second and you just listen to the action happening around you. And if you don't speak that language of that community, and you're trying to navigate your way through stuff, that sense of uncomfortableness where you're like, oh my goodness, I don't know what you're saying to me. I don't know what to do. What are you, what's happening here? You take that kind of emotion and you raise that up into not just not being able to understand the language, but you heighten that to the flip side. So we say put ourselves in the other person's shoes, and that sense of uncomfortability that we have is something that we have to be very mindful of. That sometimes there's some communities in some situations that are in that all the time and trying to navigate stuff. And so why are we always having that expectation of, oh, you're here, you should automatically just do this? And I often get the questions from my, newcomer and refugee friends are like, what does it mean to be Canadian? Like, what is Canadian? Like, what is that? What does that mean?
That's a big question. Yeah. You're like,
And I'm like, well, right.
There's so many things. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So it can just go many different ways. So, I mean, it's just always trying to be kind, like we were saying earlier, just be kind and trying to reflect on, like, if you were in that situation and something that got you riled up, so you felt offended by something or hurt by something, that's how that other person is feeling in that moment. And so it's again, how do we be kind to listen and have dialogue on seeing things from a different perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like there's probably 1,000 examples, but if anybody wants, again, to share something they question, something they're not sure about, feel free to post that in the comments. Christy, would you have, maybe this puts you on the spot a little bit, but if someone wants to learn to be better at cultural appropriation versus cultural appreciation, where do we begin that journey of knowledge? I think conversations like this are a start, but if people don't have access to someone who they could ask that question to, like, where do we learn this? Where do we get more info?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of great organizations, I think, out there in the community to that provide some cultural pieces. So many communities, I know we have our cultural associations in many towns, right? So you might have like the Dutch club, or you might have the German club, or other things that come in from there. Your, Indian friendship centers within your communities would be a great aspect to start at if you're curious about our Indigenous communities. Going in and just learning your local history. I think many of us take for granted the spaces that we sit in, right? I mean, we were doing this session yesterday, and I mean, some of the realities that we have with some of our colleagues in the room was like them acknowledging, like, absolutely, I get to live my life based on the genocide of the Indigenous population here in Canada, right? And there was a couple that were very open about that, saying like, I absolutely acknowledge that I have in a very different sense of privilege based on the oppression of another group. Yeah. And so it's, taking that deeper step of, they've gone on some journeys of saying like, knowing what, if you're in some of the centers around Canada, there's 11 treaties. If you're within a treaty area, what does that actually mean? Have you actually gone out and learned about what that means? If you're in a non-treaty area, most of BC's unceded territory, have you visited your surrounding community nations? Have you gone to any cultural events to actually learn a bit more and ask questions? People are always willing to share knowledge and information and welcome people into space. It's I think just stepping outside and opening our minds to something different. And so those are, I think, there's some smaller pieces, and they're actually more, I think, relational based. When we start to get more hands in, it's actually about building relationships. And so it's encouraging our viewers that if anyone, wherever you live in, again, I'm speaking from a Canadian context, there's someone in the US, your local Native American communities, and going to their events, to asking questions when they have festivals around in your community. I know we're coming up to May, which will be the Asian Heritage Month here in Calgary. And so like how are we stepping out into some of these pieces, into helping, one, the community celebrate, but also learning more about the community and being a part of that and asking questions. And if, being mindful of how I ask questions, I'm always conscious of that, but also being humble to know that if I offend, to apologize in that moment, say, I'm sorry if I'm being offensive and asking this question, but I don't know how else to phrase it, right? So I'm acknowledging to that person, saying, I totally don't know what I'm doing, but here's my question I'm trying to ask. And am I allowed to have that information? Or, because it might be information I'm asking, like people often like, well, can I just go to a sweat? Tell me how to run a sweat. I can't speak to that. Yeah. Right. And they're going to tell you that. And it's like, okay, I didn't know. And, how might one learn? It's just being curious and open. Yeah. And it's the way we approach things.
And there's so much power in acknowledgement. That's the other thing that I think we like to complicate things when really we can simplify it in, curious, compassion, acknowledgement. Like those Absolutely. Are, and just kindness at the end of the day. But, well, we should probably be mindful of time, Christy. We can talk for hours, but we know that you will be back to chat more. And again, too, it's the same kind of thing that if this conversation spurs something else in your brain, like you get this nudge that you're like, I wonder, I would always like to ask about this in Indigenous culture or this in something. If you don't want to post it publicly, you can send me a private message, and Christy will be back to chat more. And we always connect to be like, okay, what are we going to talk about today? And so if there's something that you want to learn a little bit more about, but you feel a little afraid to post it publicly, send it privately. And we would love to have a conversation around that, because together we are going to learn. Together we'll be better humans.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. If there's any guests or anything else that I can bring in from the community around certain things, I mean, we can definitely explore that as well. I mean, there's a lot of great knowledge holders out in our community that are always kind in sharing
When
their
I
words
think
as well.
if someone comes to mind, even for May, like you said, it's I forget what you called them, Asian History Month, or did you
Yeah,
say
Asian Heritage Month. Yeah.
Heritage Month?
Yeah.
So in that, like, if you think of someone, like, we'd love to have someone come talk to us about that. I think it would be great. So yeah, awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm gonna bid you adieu for this beautiful, snowy, cold but not cold Wednesday in our lives.
It's true.
We had some
Thanks,
good jokes
everyone.
about that off the beginning, but thank you, Christy, for your time once again, and your knowledge and your heart. We just appreciate you sharing with us, and thank you, everybody, for hanging out. Cheers to you. Have a good rest of your Wednesday, and we'll see everybody back here Friday morning at 9 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. Have a good day, everyone.